Welcome everyone to yet another episode of When Movies Were Good down here in Melbourne, Australia with Rachel and my special guest star, my weekly guest star, my only guest star, Matt.
All the better to podcast with you, my dear.
Yeah, so here we are again and we're doing our Marilyn Monroe double. And of course, you can't do a half an hour podcast and try to think that you could do Marilyn Monroe justice, but as we always say, we're just two friends discussing films. We pick out sort of a theme or a person that connect the films, and that's how we figure out the films that we're going to do. So Marilyn is the link in both of the films that we're doing today. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1953, and The 7 Year Itch, 1955. And yeah, they were both vehicles for her in her very famous, amazing, still known to this day, career that was tragically cut short. What are your thoughts about Marilyn Monroe, Matt? Do you have anything off the top of your head that you...
Well, it's tragically sad that for many new generations of moviegoers, long before they are exposed to Marilyn's films, they are more exposed to the one of these tragic tales of falling into drug abuse and having an early death, and being this victim of Hollywood. And then that's completely at odds because, yes, she obviously had these personal troubles, but when you look at her films, like you'd sort of half expect from her reputation to be the beginning of one of these 60s tragedies with lots of drugs, like a bit like, what was her name? She was like Andy Warhol's movie protege.
Jane Mansfield, or?
No. Yeah, like Marilyn Monroe's films are almost like Doris Day level by modern standards. Hardly the most taboo stuff, and so yeah, like obviously that doesn't mean that because you have wholesome or non-wholesome or girl next door type roles, how that doesn't necessarily impact your personal life, but it's quite unfair that she's known for this sad personal life before her movies.
Yeah, that's true. So, yeah, she's such a pop icon, but I think a lot of people are fascinated with Marilyn because behind this pin-up image is this very deeply troubled woman. And not to mention that, but the circumstances surrounding her death have always been the stuff of conspiracy theories because she was involved with a president and his brother at the time. And a lot of people believe that there could be something to do with the two of them. So even in death, there was always like a question mark hanging over. I mean, they ruled it like an accidental death, or some people believe she purposely took the mix of barbiturates that she did that caused her death. But then other people have always believed that she was involved with people too high up. And
I don't know. Personally, I think the most intimately she was involved with any people of power was in an intimate sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I even was watching a documentary once that Jackie Kennedy, would answer the phone and say, "Is that you, Marilyn?" There. So she was aware of their involvement, but then she got involved with his brother Bobby as well. So
Kennedy got around, though.
Yeah, that's true enough. So just to recap a little bit about Marilyn, of course, that was her stage name. Her name, she was born Norma Jean Baker or Norma Jean Mortensen, because she grew up in the foster care system in Los Angeles, California in 1926 and sadly died August the 4th, 1962 at aged only 36. So you can actually visit Marilyn's grave because it's in that very famous Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, and she's in one of the sort of the wall caskets there. So, I mean, I'm sure that's a pilgrimage a lot of people make. Marilyn was married 4 times, most famously to... three times, most famously to Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player, and Arthur Miller, the very famous playwright. Sort of an odd couple they would have been, but funnily enough...
Yeah, kind of chalk and cheese. That would be like Neil Gaiman marrying Kate Blanchett.
Yeah. Well, so she got married to her first husband, James or Jim, when she was 16, and she was working in a factory in World War II. And then, of course, like some of these things happen for some of these people. She met a photographer, and the rest is history. Basically, she started sort of modeling, pin-up modeling, and then went to 20th Century Fox and Columbia Pictures, and then started getting involved in roles. And then by the early 50s, she was sort of one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. And that's from the period of where these two movies are. So Matt and I were reading before that she actually did try and start a production company, and then studied, method acting with Lee Strasberg at his famous Actors Centre. So I was watching a documentary once many years ago that she really struggled there because she did suffer from mood disorders and other sorts of things. So I think it was she just had a hard life. A lot of that stuff wasn't diagnosed properly.
And I think studying method acting at that time would have affected her condition even more deeply and it kind of got on the bad side with a lot of actors at the time, like James Dean and that generation, because method acting was originally developed in Russia in the early 1900s, and as it moved further to the United States, it became more and more diluted and evolved into a sort of pseudo-pop psychology, often managed by a lot of half actors, half sham psychiatrists, which try to engage in these mental depths of different actors, and quite often got them into bad psychological situations that they weren't necessarily qualified or prepared to get them out of again.
Yeah, I remember we were at high school doing high school drama, and this new drama teacher rocked up and he wanted us to study is it Stanislavski? Is that the Russian guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, hello, we're 16. I don't think we really need to be studying that for high school drama class.
What it began with was an attempt to sort of synthesize what made a very good acting performance, and I've done a couple of short courses where done by someone who did study in Russia the original method, and it is interesting, but it's much more practical when you get to the sort of the pure faith. It's much less of this sort of almost vanity, self-indulgence nonsense that you often see in actors, where you get to some extremes like Heath Ledger taking on drug abuse because of a role, etc.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of it.
Rest in peace, but method acting isn't it about turning yourself inside out 24/7?
Yeah, I know, and you hear of other people not speaking to people on the set. I think Christian Bale's a bit like that and stuff. I can understand it when you're on the set and you're doing the scene and everything, but when you're walking around like that and you're off the set, I mean, you can sort of, separate yourself a little bit if you feel it'll help your performance. But I think
fine, you need to be in the zone to an extent during it, but you have to be realistic. Yeah,
definitely. So I don't think that was probably the best fit for poor Marilyn, but, good on her for giving it a go.
And I think starting your own production company at that time was a fairly modern thing to do. I mean, we're used to actors taking a much more heavy hand in the executive matters, but that was the new age.
And remember Olivia de Havilland's lawsuit when she wanted to get out of her contract and everything. So it was good. Like, I don't think she had that on-screen persona of the dumb blonde, and as we were reading before, her on-screen persona was definitely developed with the male gaze in mind. But she was so much more than that. But look, every single actor, to one degree or another, unless you're some great unknown character actor, is stereotyped in one way, shape, or form.
And sometimes it's a bit unusual when you, in retrospect, see how different actors are objectified. Like, I read an article which I thought was kind of offensive to a lot of women of that generation who idolized Audrey Hepburn, and they were suddenly told in retrospect that was a product for the male gaze. And I'm thinking, don't get me wrong, Audrey Hepburn was a beautiful person, but I didn't feel like it was crafted. Her identity was crafted in the same way Marilyn's was.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because she was, she had dark hair, and there was just something, when you're that blonde bombshell, it's just something that really appeals to the sort of, not to every man, but most men do find that.
Speaking as a male, it's a stereotype that if you have blonde hair, you're automatically more beautiful. That's like saying a car's better when it's red.
Yeah, that's true. Although there is that old saying about why people get red cars. So we'll jump into our first film here, which is the very famous, very well-known musical comedy of 1953, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I'd always seen some of the famous showpieces in this film, but I hadn't seen it from start to finish. So just briefly, Marilyn plays Lorelei, who is a showgirl, and she decides to go for a trip to Paris with her friend Dorothy. Now, there's a subplot with her wanting to get married to this man whose father doesn't feel that she's good enough for her, so that sort of figures into the plot as well. Before her wedding with the rich Gus Esmond, so that's the gentleman that she's trying to get married to, her father-in-law sends a private eye detective to keep an eye on her, and he decides to keep an eye more on Lorelei, aka Marilyn's friend, who plays Dorothy, played by the wonderful Jane Russell. And lots of thrills and spills ensue with people getting, trying to be charged with crimes and all sorts of things. And it all ends up really well with a nice big double wedding at the end and lots of nice musical numbers. So what was your feelings on this film, Matt?
I liked the storyline and the musical numbers. It's really nice to sort of dive into that kind of age of optimism that is missing these days. But some of the humour I thought were quite nice. I like that part when the little kid's there.
Yes, and he was very good, yeah.
He's trying to, in a 10-year-old way, trick Marilyn.
Yeah, that's right, and she was hanging out the window and all this sort of stuff. But funnily enough, Howard Hawks directed this film, and he had directed the original Scarface, Bringing Up Baby, Red River, Rio Bravo. So he was... Now, I'm thinking of Howard Hughes, sorry. There's Howard Hughes, with the guy with all the planes and all that stuff, and then there's Howard Hawks. Yeah, so apparently they were saying in this one here, in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, that he was perhaps not the right fit for this film, to direct the film, because he didn't actually direct a lot of the musical sequences I was reading. He left it to other people, some of the choreographers and things like that.
Not surprising.
And as a result, I don't even think he was there for Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, which is the big showpiece that Marilyn sings from the movie. So this movie also starred, now let's see who... Let's just go down. I actually really liked... I'd never really seen him before. Is it... Malone, Elliot Reed. I actually really liked him. I hadn't seen him in anything before, and this was one of the big roles that he did. I'm just going through and having a look at his Gentlemen Prefer, and then he sort of did some Walt Disney films in the 60s.
He kind of gave off that vibe.
Yeah, and probably more television, so he was more known as a television actor. So he even appeared on Seinfeld, they were saying, in the early years of that. So, geez.
Everyone did.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm sure once the show got famous. So, and it was based on it was based on a stage play, that's right. It was based on the musical Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, with the music by Jules Stein, who's one of the, very famous sort of musical person, and Carol Channing. That's where I know, because I remember Carol Channing, and she used to sing that song as well. So, I mean, look, it was a beautiful looking film. All of these musical films from this era are. It's distributed by 20th Century Fox, the cinematography by Harry J. Wilde. It's just a nice, fun film, and Marilyn's gorgeous in it. But you prefer Jane Russell, I heard.
Like I said, it's just I think it's probably only one stereotype of beauty that Marilyn was allocated to, but there's different ideals.
Yeah, and I actually thought her voice really suited the role when they were singing, although I did read, when she sort of goes into the upper register, I think it's in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, when she's doing the no, no, no part, that was Marnie Nixon, who was very famous for overdubbing Deborah Kerr in The King and I, and I mean Marnie Nixon overdubbed for a lot of people, because like when she hit that sort of high note, I was like, oh, I don't know if Marilyn had that range, did she? And then when I read that it was Marnie Nixon, that makes sense. But I love Marnie Nixon, so
I wouldn't have put it together in my head because thinking of The King and I can't remember any tunes that require that much of a high note.
Well, I just don't think Deborah Kerr was much of a singer. So I think they just gave Marnie...
more school teacher.
Yeah, and Marnie was one of the... Obviously, Julie Andrews didn't need any help singing, but I think Marnie was actually one of the nuns in The Sound of Music. But Marnie was just very famous for overdubbing for people who needed help singing.
It's funny, I actually heard on YouTube this morning there was an old television clip of Julie Andrews with the original Maria von Trapp, and she was giving her a quick yodeling lesson.
Yeah, actually, I've seen that clip come up, but I've never actually seen it. So I thought the film was nice. I'm just trying to compare. Still, my favourite Marilyn film will always and forever be Some Like It Hot.
Well, that's because you like men who are into cross-dressing.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I just love Joe E. Brown, as you know, as what's his name now? I'm just thinking, oh, no, I've completely drawn a blank. But you know who Joey Brown is out there. You know which character he played. Osgood Fielding, that's right. Okay, so if we're going to go over to Marilyn's other film that we're going to discuss. So let me just pull up the notes on that one. So this is The 7 Year Itch, and this film produces one of the most iconic moments in film, where Marilyn has that famous scene with her dress billowing over the subway, which has been recreated in many other films, including one of my favourites, The Woman in Red, with Kelly LeBrock, doing that in front of Gene Wilder in a very humorous way over the grill in the car park, which was hilarious. So this film was based on a play, a very successful play, directed by Billy Wilder, of course. Can he do no wrong?
Nope.
So, his repertoire of films is just amazing. So, in the midst of a summer heatwave, New Yorker Richard Sherman, played by Tom Ewell, ships his wife, played by Evelyn Keyes, and their son off to Maine for a vacation. Left alone in the heat, they kept stressing how hot Manhattan was at that time.
It gets very humid in summer.
Yeah, I've been there as well at that time. It does get humid. I mean, we're Aussies and we're used to humid weather, but it does. Well, you do feel it definitely I think because there's so many people around, it's crowded and.
And New York, so particularly Manhattan, it's a concrete island.
Jungle,
so, that's the way that they were actually talking about Western Sydney, some of the heat problems, and I think it's probably similar.
Yeah, I think Western Sydney's gotten out of control, but. And so he's left alone to work back in Manhattan, and he comes across a gorgeous blonde model played by none other than Marilyn, and he becomes infatuated and starts fantasizing about her. And so this film sort of raises questions of infidelity. And as it says here, Richard dreams of his beautiful new neighbour, but will his fantasies about her become a reality? I think she was more interested in his air conditioning, wasn't she?
Exactly, and I think it's also one of those movies where you're sort of really glad in retrospect for the restrictions that placed how they could portray the script. I mean, the censors at the time outright forbid the display of adultery, literal adultery, and the director, Billy, 20 years later was saying, how much easier it would have been for him in that time during the interview, like in the late 70s or something, when most of those restrictions had gone. But I actually think the film would have been a lot better the way it is. And in a way you could think of that whole film in microcosm embedding whether or not it's a good idea to have sex on screen as a whole. And it's like I seem to mention him every 2 weeks, but he provided so many quotes, and it's like Hitchcock said when discussing the value of being able to show sex on screen, and he does have a point of once you've shown it anyway, what more is there to do?
Yeah, that's right. You know, Matt's renowned for doing Hitchcock quotes, and I'm renowned for doing can we connect
Larry Hagman references.
Larry Hagman into this film. And guys, guess what I have? Because the famous white dress that Marilyn wore when she was standing over the grate and the air was blowing it all around, just that iconic image, That was designed by the costume director or costume designer, Bill or William Travilla. And William Travilla, at Dallas's heyday, designed the costumes on Dallas. Well, the big gowns that the ladies wore. So I don't know if he actually ever designed anything for Larry. Yeah, the shoulder padded gown. So that's the only connection that I can see for this one. But nevertheless, you know.
Look, I'm sure Larry Hagman smiled at her picture now and then.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true, because his mum sort of represented a different part of the, you know, female performing arts, being sort of mostly on Broadway. But Tom Yule, who played the character Richard in the film, he actually did play the character on Broadway for quite a long time in the production of The 7 Year Itch. So it's nice that he got the chance. It's always nice when the person who's renowned for playing the character on the stage gets a chance to play the character in the film.
Yeah. What I'm thinking with Marilyn's portrayal on the screen, and that often seems to speak to the image that was projected of her, is that it's not only that you have Marilyn as someone who would have probably struggled to get much attention and respect in life other than making it as a star in show business, but in so many of her roles, she's portrayed as someone in show business.
Yeah,
and,
that's true.
Like, to an extent, it's a similar psychology that's being projected, that was projected for a long time in Hollywood, and to an extent even now, that where sort of your hopes of happiness are pinned on a break into stardom. But certainly for a lot of Marilyn Monroe's generation, it was kind of you dream of either finding that stardom or marrying someone of wealth to have that life of walking onto a boat with a big feather in your hair.
Well, that's right. Well, that's her character in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes definitely had that, until at the end of the film where she gave the potential father-in-law a speech about, you know, discussing things about, you know, being happy and what would you want if, you know, the shoe was on the other sort of foot sort of thing, and that swayed the dad over to it. So, yeah, I don't know, which did you prefer one of the films over the other, or they were just different things to you?
I think The 7 Year Itch I'd watch over and over again because I love the humour, and that's, again, if they had simply made it an outright sex manifestation, first of all, it would not be much of a comedy. That would basically be a recreation of every Italian opera.
Yeah, that's right.
Minus the baritone getting the troops in.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what really helps to create the humour and the sort of the moral conniption that I'm guessing probably a lot of people in a midlife crisis are going through.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I love musicals because I love having a good old sing-along, as you well know. And I did definitely have a sing-along, and it was nice to see, I'd only ever seen pieces of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, so it was sort of nice to actually sit down and watch the whole thing from start to finish. I did enjoy seeing how that iconic song that she sings, Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, how that actually fit into the story and how they worked it in there. And there's been so many people who've, ripped off that, Madonna famously in her Material Girl.
And even that movie Burlesque with Christina Aguilera, where it's all completely set around a club where they spend all their time miming to Marilyn Monroe type songs.
Oh, really? I haven't seen Burlesque.
It's not my cup of tea, and it's probably not yours either.
No.
But I think your mum would like it.
Yeah, exactly. I just, as I was saying to Matt, I think the last modern film I went to see, I fell asleep in it, and I often fall asleep in them. I just don't really enjoy modern films. I actually still don't mind a good English film, and I'm happy to try and give some Aussie films a go. But the stuff that comes out of mainstream Hollywood, I just, some of the quirky Hollywood stuff, I'm actually more interested in like the B and C and D grade stuff that comes out, like Sharknado, and at least you get a laugh out of that,
I don't know, I think the last few years it's just been, people have just been too scared.
Yeah, it's just too much politically correct stuff. And, you know, there was a time and place for all that, but I think we just need to really kind of move on from all that stuff now.
Well, it's kind of even a problem in Australian drama where I think a lot of the storylines can be often a bit too careful and held back, and I'm guessing part of it is that sort of the biggest blessing and curse in the Australian film industry is that a great part of it is funded through government bodies, and so that means that the people who make the movies, because of their financial basis, often are inclined to think like politicians.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. That's something, you know, I think Canada is probably in a similar position. I notice that a lot of Canadian government funds a lot of Canadian productions, not the American productions made in Canada, but the local Canadian productions. And I think smaller countries like Ireland and stuff are the same. They just don't have the amount of people to generate enough sort of organic income off the movies. So,
yeah. And you could probably also imagine a particular generation of script writers and filmmakers have a very tight control of the industry for long periods, and that kind of greatly affect the tone of filmmaking.
Yeah, definitely. So it was nice to take a visit with Marilyn. I'm sure we'll take a few more visits with her. There's still some other great films. Is it all right if I keep the box set that you lent me for a while? And
fine with me. There's a lot of content to go through.
Yeah. I was actually looking at it, and I thought I wouldn't actually mind watching all of these films and diving a bit deeper into her repertoire. So that's us. That's our visit with Marilyn this week. It's always good to see her. My mum's a big fan of classic movies. Of course, Elizabeth Taylor's her idol, but she also loved Marilyn. I was telling Matt before we started recording that my mum was like 12, just turning 12 when Marilyn died. And she said she ran it. I don't know where she heard it, but she ran into the classroom and said, "Oh my God, Marilyn Monroe's died." And they're like, "Yeah, right." And then they all went home and found out that it was true.
These days, if you go into a classroom like that, and everybody would have their phones with their Twitter feed and be like, "Tell us something we don't know."
Yeah, that's right. But she said that's one of a memory from her childhood that always stands out when she found out that Marilyn Monroe had passed away.
Well, that's about around the age when you will take on a memory of a major media event. Like when I was 9, that's when 9/11 happened. So, and that's kind of when you form a big impression of how the world is functioning, depending on what major events are happening at the time. And
yeah, that's definitely true. So yeah, I mean, definitely her death, her life and death. You know, it was a very, you know, it was filled with the highest of highs, but the lowest of lows. And it's just a shame that she wasn't living at a time where she could have gotten probably a bit more help for her emotional stability. But there's no doubt, I think Joe and Arthur Miller did love her. They seemed, I mean, you saw Joe when he had her funeral and stuff, and he was genuinely quite broken up about it.
Well, I don't think many people go into a marriage from the beginning without some sort of affection or hope for the positive future. But yeah, it just doesn't always work out, and it fascinates me how in places like Hollywood relationships can evaporate so quickly.
Yeah, and I think she miscarried a few times, and that was a very troubling and sad thing for her because she wanted to be a mother. And yeah, so she did go through, it sounded like she had a bit of a, you know, she had some amazing things in her life, but there was always that shadow following her around. So, you know, it's just a tragedy. Unfortunately, she couldn't get through that, and she couldn't finish the last film that she was trying to make, Something's Got to Give, which they, you know, it's amazing watching that footage of her in that film because she'd actually lost a bit of weight, and she was really, you know, she was 36, which then is kind of a bit oldish, but now it's not. But
well, Jane Russell, who appeared alongside Marilyn in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes when she was in older age, a journalist asked her what was probably a naive question of why did she stop making pictures, and she responded to him, because I got older than 30, and because back then, unless you were wanting to go expand into character actors, it was like being an Olympic athlete. You were kind of it was kind of, you were young and beautiful, or you weren't in Hollywood. Yeah,
I think Katharine Hepburn and a few others, they managed to, because they went into more character-based sort of roles, but it was their roles were sort of few and far between, really, weren't they?
Exactly, and for some people that's fine, but also when you've been doing a particular trade for over 10 years, I suppose you decide then if you want to stick with it or not.
Yeah, that's true. So we're going to wrap up now, but we will introduce what we are planning to do on our next one. We wanted to take another visit with Jimmy Stewart because we both love Jimmy Stewart. We have done a few of his films before. We've done a couple of ones connected with him before. But these are just two that we had especially the second one. I had always wanted to see this. I remember watching it on a Saturday afternoon many years ago, and I never got to finish it. So I said, you know what, Matt, let's do these two just because they're two very well-known films and they are vehicles for James. So we're going to do Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939. And we're going to do Harvey, 1950. And Harvey's the one that I really want to take another look at because it just looks so interesting. And that could be, Matt and I sort of have an involvement with the local theatre company. I think Matt should suggest to the play committee to do Harvey.
Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of volunteers for the bunny role.
Yeah,
unless they do it for the summer season, then it might be a bit harder to get volunteers.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to come to you and we're going to have a nice visit with James Stewart, the great Jimmy Stewart, next time we see you. But in the meantime, as you well know, I'm Rachel.
I'm Matthew.
And we're watching good movies. See you and good night.